I was the forgotten child until I walked away for good. My parents made it clear my younger brother was the golden child, and I was just an afterthought. No matter what I did, I was never enough. I worked hard, excelled in school, and built my own success. But when I asked if they had saved anything for my future, nothing. Then came the final betrayal. I invited them to a special dinner, hoping to reconnect, only to be stood up because they were shopping for my brother's birthday gift. That's when I realized I wasn't their child. I was their backup plan. So I walked away. And when they tried to guilt me back, I shut the door forever. I've known for as long as I can remember that I wasn't the favorite child in my family. I wish I could say this was just some exaggerated feeling of mine or a phase I went through, but it wasn't. It was real. So real it shaped my entire childhood and even my adulthood. My parents, whether intentionally or not, made it painfully clear that my younger brother, Ethan, was more valuable to them. I was always the afterthought, the second-place kid in a two-child family. And honestly, that realization is something I've carried with me my whole life. It all started when Ethan was born just a year after me. My parents hadn't planned to have another baby so soon. But when my mom found out she was pregnant, she and my dad were over the moon. They couldn't wait to expand their little family and give me a sibling. I think at that point they really did believe we'd be a happy family of 4. But things took a sharp turn when the doctors ran some tests and discovered that Ethan might have serious health complications. I was too young to remember any of this firsthand, of course, but I've heard the story countless times from my grandparents. The doctors told my parents that Ethan had a significant heart defect and that it might require surgeries, even multiple surgeries, just for him to survive. They were also warned that the pregnancy itself could be risky. My parents were devastated. For weeks, they wrestled with the idea of whether or not to continue with the pregnancy. It was the kind of heartbreaking decision no one ever wants to face, and it weighed heavily on them. In the end, they decided to go through with it. I think they believed they could handle whatever challenges came their way. But when Ethan was born, those challenges became all too real. His heart condition was even worse than the doctors had feared. He needed immediate surgery, and even that wasn't a guarantee. My parents' world flipped upside down as they dove headfirst into a life consumed by hospital visits, medical bills, and endless worry over their fragile newborn. And where was I in all of this? Pushed to the sidelines. It's not that I blame them for being so focused on Ethan in those early months. I mean, what else could they do? He was literally fighting for his life. But as a toddler, I didn't understand any of that. All I knew was that my mom and dad were suddenly too busy for me. They couldn't care for 2 kids while Ethan was in the hospital, so they decided to send me to live with my grandparents for a little while. At the time, they framed it as temporary, just until Ethan stabilized and they could bring him home. But deep down, I think that was the moment they mentally handed me off for good. Living with my grandparents wasn't bad at all. In fact, they were amazing. My grandma was one of those warm, nurturing types who could make you feel better just by being around her. Every morning, she'd make me pancakes shaped like animals or stars, and we'd sit at the table together, talking about whatever was on my tiny mind. In the afternoons, we'd bake cookies or work in her garden. She'd let me help pick vegetables or plant flowers, and she always made me feel like I was part of something important. My grandpa was just as incredible. He'd take me to the park to feed the ducks or push me on the swings until I was laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. At night, he'd read me stories before bed. Sometimes the same ones over and over because he knew they were my favorites. They gave me a sense of stability and love that I didn't even realize I was missing from my parents. But no matter how wonderful my grandparents were, there was still a part of me that longed for my mom and dad. I didn't understand why they had sent me away. I didn't know why they couldn't visit more often or why every time they called it was to talk to my grandparents about Ethan, not me. They rarely asked to speak to me on the phone. And when they did come by for a visit, which wasn't often, it felt like they were just going through the motions. They'd bring a toy or two for me, but their hearts weren't really in it. Their conversations were always about Ethan, how he was doing, how the doctors were optimistic about his recovery, how he was their little fighter. I think I started to realize even at that young age that I was no longer a priority. My parents' world revolved around Ethan and I was just there. I tried not to let it bother me too much. My grandparents made sure I felt loved, and for a while that was enough. When Ethan finally got well enough to come home from the hospital, I thought, this is it. This is when I get to go home too. I imagine what it would be like to be a family again, to sit at the dinner table with my parents, to have them tuck me in at night. I thought maybe now that Ethan was better, they'd have room in their lives for me again. But that didn't happen. My mom told my grandparents, "We're just not ready for 2 kids yet." She said Ethan still needed so much care and attention that they couldn't handle the added responsibility of looking after me too. My dad, who was busy working long hours to pay off Ethan's medical bills, didn't argue. My grandparents, being the kind and selfless people they were, didn't protest either. They loved having me around, so they agreed to keep caring for me. I don't think I fully understood what that meant at the time. I was only 4 years old. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, it became clear that my parents weren't coming back for me. What was supposed to be temporary had quietly turned into something permanent. My grandparents became my primary caregivers, and my parents became more like distant relatives who occasionally stopped by. I don't want to make it seem like I had a terrible childhood. I didn't. My grandparents gave me a good life. They made sure I had everything I needed: clothes, school supplies, a warm bed to sleep in. They went to every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every awards ceremony. They were there for me in ways my parents never were. But even with all their love and care, there was a hole in my heart that only my parents could have filled. And they weren't interested in filling it. As I got older, I started to notice how differently they treated Ethan. He was their pride and joy, their miracle baby. Every conversation, every decision, every moment seemed to revolve around him. And me? I was just there. A reminder of the life they had before everything became about Ethan. I learned to live with it. What choice did I have? After it became clear that I wasn't going back to live with my parents anytime soon, I settled into my life with my grandparents. Looking back, they were my saving grace. Without them, I don't know how I would have survived emotionally. They became the parents I didn't have, the ones who saw me, heard me, and made me feel like I mattered. My grandma was the epitome of warmth. She had this way of making even the smallest things feel special. Breakfast wasn't just food. It was an event. She'd wake up early to make my favorite pancakes or waffles, humming a tune as she worked in the kitchen. I remember sitting at the table, swinging my legs and watching her with admiration. She always had time for me. Whether it was helping me color in my favorite coloring books, or teaching me how to bake cookies. We spent hours together in the garden, planting flowers and vegetables. To this day, the smell of fresh soil and blooming flowers brings me back to those moments with her. My grandpa was just as wonderful. He had this calming presence that made me feel safe no matter what. He'd take me to the park where we'd feed ducks and fly kites. He taught me how to ride a bike, patiently holding onto the back until I got the hang of it. At night, he'd sit by my bed and read me stories. He had a deep, soothing voice, and even when he was tired from working around the house all day, he never skipped our nightly ritual. They made me feel like I was the center of their world, even if my parents couldn't do the same. But as much as I loved my grandparents, there was always a part of me that felt like something was missing. I wanted my parents. I wanted to go home. At first, I told myself that it was only temporary. My parents were just overwhelmed with Ethan's medical needs, and once things settled down, they'd come for me. But as the years went by, it became harder to hold on to that hope. The reality was clear. I was no longer a priority to them. Their visits became fewer and farther between. When they did come, they never stayed long. My mom would bring Ethan along, and my dad would sit with my grandparents, updating them on Ethan's latest milestones or health updates. They'd gush about how strong and brave he was, how proud they were of him. And me? They barely acknowledged I was there. If they brought a gift, it was always something small and impersonal, like they grabbed it from a gas station on the way over. I remember one time when I was about 6 or 7, I tried to get my dad's attention during one of their visits. I had just learned to ride my bike without training wheels, and I was so proud of myself. I begged him to come outside so I could show him. He nodded absently, promising to watch in just a minute. But that minute never came. He was too busy talking about Ethan's new doctor or therapy session. I ended up riding my bike in the driveway alone, waiting for a father who never came out to see me. It wasn't just their lack of attention. It was the way they talked about Ethan that really hurt. Every visit, they'd go on and on about him like he was some kind of miracle. And maybe he was. I know his health struggles were serious. And I don't begrudge him for needing their attention. But as a kid, it felt like Ethan was the only thing that mattered to them. I was just there. Forgotten. My grandparents did their best to fill the void. They were at every school play, every parent-teacher conference, and every little event that mattered to me. When I brought home good grades, they'd celebrate with my favorite dinner or take me out for ice cream. They made me feel seen and valued in ways my parents never did. But no matter how much love they gave me, it couldn't fully replace what I craved from my mom and dad. I remember sitting in my room at night, staring out the window and wondering why I wasn't good enough for them. Why didn't they love me the way they loved Ethan? Why didn't they want me? The contrast between how I was treated and how Ethan was treated became even more glaring as we got older. Whenever I visited my parents' house, it was like walking into a shrine to Ethan. The walls were lined with pictures of him. Ethan at the beach, Ethan with a trophy, Ethan smiling at a birthday party. There were barely any pictures of me. If there were, they were old ones from when I was a toddler, shoved into a corner of the mantle or stuck in a drawer somewhere. Ethan's birthdays were elaborate celebrations, complete with decorations, catered food, and a mountain of presents. My own birthdays were a quiet affair with my grandparents. They always made an effort to make me feel special, but it was hard not to compare. One year my mom and dad didn't even call to wish me a happy birthday. My grandma tried to cheer me up by baking me a cake and inviting a few neighbors over. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an afterthought in my own family. One memory that stands out happened when I was about 10. It was Ethan's birthday, and my grandparents brought me to the party. I remember walking into a house filled with balloons, streamers, and the sound of laughter. Ethan was at the center of it all, basking in the attention. My parents were running around, making sure everything was perfect for him. I tried to join in, but the feeling of being invisible was overwhelming. I watched as my parents doted on Ethan, their faces lighting up every time he spoke. I felt like I was on the outside looking in, a guest at my own family's party. At one point I couldn't hold it in anymore. I started crying loud, uncontrollable sobs that I couldn't stop. My grandparents quickly took me to a quiet room to calm me down, but I could tell my parents were furious. Later, my mom scolded me for ruining Ethan's birthday. She told me I was being selfish and childish, that it wasn't my day, so I needed to stop making everything about me. That moment stuck with me. It was the first time I really understood my place in the family. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't even equal. I was just there. Over time I learned to accept it, or at least I tried to. My grandparents were my rock, and they gave me all the love and support they could. But deep down, I still longed for my parents' approval. I wanted to matter to them. I wanted them to see me the way they saw Ethan. Even as I got older and started to understand the complexities of their situation, the hurt never fully went away. It was a wound that never quite healed, a constant reminder that I would always come second to my brother. No matter how hard I tried to be good enough, it was never enough. By the time I was old enough to really understand what was happening in my family, it had become painfully clear that my parents' favoritism toward Ethan wasn't just a phase or a result of his early health struggles. It was the foundation of our family dynamic. Ethan was their pride and joy, the miracle child who survived against all odds, and I was the forgotten one. If I had ever hoped that things would change as we got older, those hopes were dashed as the years went by. Ethan's health had improved significantly by the time we both reached grade school. He no longer needed constant medical attention, though he still had regular checkups and occasional issues to manage. With his health stabilized, you'd think my parents would have had more time and energy to focus on me. But they didn't. Their attention and affection were so centered on Ethan that it was as if they had no room left for me. I only saw my parents sporadically, mostly on weekends when they would stop by my grandparents' house. Even then, the visits felt more like obligations than genuine attempts to spend time with me. They would come in, sit on the couch, and talk endlessly about Ethan, how he was doing in school, what sports he was trying out for, how proud they were of him. They rarely asked my grandparents about me, and they certainly didn't ask me directly. I could be sitting right there in the room and it was like I didn't exist. I remember one visit in particular when I was about 8. I had just won a small art contest at school, and my teacher had sent me home with a ribbon and a certificate. I was so proud of myself. My grandparents had already celebrated with me the night before, but I couldn't wait to show my parents when they came over that weekend. I ran to my room to grab the certificate and ribbon, and I brought them out with a big smile on my face. "Look what I won," I said, holding them up proudly. My mom barely glanced at them. "That's nice, sweetie," she said before turning back to my grandparents to continue her story about Ethan's latest doctor's appointment. My dad didn't even acknowledge me. He was too busy scrolling through his phone. I stood there for a moment, holding the ribbon in my hands, before quietly going back to my room. I tucked the certificate into a drawer and never brought it up again. That moment hurt more than I can put into words. It wasn't just that they didn't care about my little accomplishment. It was the way they dismissed me so casually, as if I were nothing more than background noise in their lives. It was a feeling I would come to know all too well. As I got older, the differences in how my parents treated me and Ethan became even more pronounced. Ethan wasn't a great student. He struggled to keep up with his schoolwork and often brought home mediocre grades. But to my parents, everything he did was worthy of celebration. If he managed to pass a test he had failed before, they'd throw a mini party at home. They'd order pizza, take him out for ice cream, or post about how proud they were of his efforts on social media. Meanwhile, I excelled in school. I got straight A's, made the honor roll every year, and even won a few academic awards. My grandparents were always there to cheer me on, but my parents? They never once attended an award ceremony or congratulated me on my achievements. I could have cured cancer, and it still wouldn't have been enough to pull their attention away from Ethan. One time, I overheard my grandparents trying to talk to my parents about me. I was in the hallway just out of sight when I heard my grandma say, "You know, you really should be proud of her. She works so hard in school. She's such a bright girl." My mom sighed. "Yeah, but school always came easy for her. It's not like she has to try as hard as Ethan does." That sentence crushed me. It didn't matter how much I achieved or how hard I worked. To them, I didn't deserve recognition because it came easier to me. Ethan, on the other hand, could get a participation ribbon in gym class, and they'd act like he'd won an Olympic gold medal. The favoritism extended beyond school, too. Every holiday, every birthday, every family event, it was always about Ethan. On Christmas morning, the pile of presents under the tree would be overwhelmingly for him. If I was lucky, I'd get a sweater or a book, while Ethan got toys, gadgets, and everything else on his wish list. One year, my parents got him a new bike. His third bike, by the way, and all I got was a journal. My grandma tried to make up for it by sneaking me an extra present after dinner, but the message from my parents was clear. Ethan came first. I remember another particularly painful moment on one of my birthdays. I must have been around 9 or 10. My grandparents had thrown me a small party at their house, just the four of us, with a homemade cake and a couple of balloons. I wasn't expecting my parents to do anything grand, but I thought they'd at least call or stop by. They didn't. When my grandma called to ask if they were coming over, my mom casually said, "Oh, we forgot. We're taking Ethan to the movies tonight. Tell her happy birthday for us." That night, as I sat at the table blowing out my candles, I made a wish. I wished my parents would love me as much as they loved Ethan. But even as I made that wish, I knew it wouldn't come true. One of the hardest parts of their favoritism was how they talked about Ethan in front of me. Every time they visited, it was the same story: Ethan this, Ethan that. They'd gush about how brave he was, how much progress he was making, how proud they were of him for overcoming his health struggles. I understood that Ethan had been through a lot, more than I ever had to face, but it still stung to hear them talk about him like he was a hero while completely ignoring me. I started to feel invisible, like I was just a shadow in my own family. It didn't matter what I did or how hard I tried. Nothing was ever enough to make them see me. The only people who truly saw me were my grandparents, and while I was so grateful for their love, I couldn't help but feel the void left by my parents. As I got older, I learned to stop expecting anything from them. I stopped hoping they'd show up to my school events. I stopped telling them about my achievements. I stopped trying to get their attention altogether. It was easier that way, less painful. If I didn't expect anything, I couldn't be disappointed. But deep down, I still wanted them to notice me. I still wanted them to care. Every time I visited my parents' house, it was a reminder of where I stood. Their home was practically a shrine to Ethan. His trophies, medals, and pictures were everywhere. There was even a framed photo of Ethan on their mantle, taken after one of his surgeries, with the words "Our little fighter" engraved on the frame. There were no photos of me. It was like I didn't exist in their world. And yet I kept hoping. I kept wishing for a day when they'd see me, not as an afterthought, not as a burden, but as their child. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned to stop expecting much from my parents. They were consistent in one thing: Ethan was their world, and I was the extra piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. I had resigned myself to that reality, but it didn't mean the pain went away. It lingered, buried beneath layers of resilience and self-reliance I had to build to get through life. Thankfully, my grandparents continued to be my rock. They supported me in ways that went far beyond what I could have ever expected from them. They were at every school meeting, every award ceremony, every little moment where I needed someone to be proud of me. My grandma was my biggest cheerleader, always reminding me how smart and capable I was. My grandpa gave me life lessons in his quiet, thoughtful way, teaching me how to stand tall even when the odds felt stacked against me. I threw myself into academics, partly because I genuinely loved learning, but also because it was the one area of my life where I could shine. If my parents weren't going to notice me, at least I could prove to myself that I was worth something. I became the kind of student teachers loved: straight A's, involved in clubs, always volunteering for extra projects. My grandparents encouraged me every step of the way, celebrating every report card like I'd won a Nobel Prize. But even with all my achievements, my parents remained uninterested. They never asked about my grades, never attended a single school event, and never once expressed pride in anything I accomplished. I remember once overhearing my grandma gently try to nudge my mom into recognizing my hard work. She said, "You should be proud of her. She's doing so well in school." My mom's response? "Well, of course she is. She's always been a good student. It's not like it's a surprise." That was the extent of her acknowledgement. It wasn't pride, it was dismissal, as if my success was inevitable and therefore unremarkable. Meanwhile, Ethan's every minor achievement was treated like a monumental event. He passed a math test? Celebration. He managed to stay out of trouble at school for a week? Ice cream night. It didn't matter that I was on the honor roll or winning academic awards. To my parents, Ethan was the only one who deserved attention. As high school progressed, I started thinking seriously about college. My grandparents had always encouraged me to dream big, telling me I could go anywhere if I worked hard enough. But as excited as I was about the idea of college, I couldn't ignore the financial reality. Even with good grades and the potential for scholarships, tuition was expensive, and I didn't know how I was going to afford it. One evening, I decided to bring it up with my parents. They had stopped by for a rare visit, and I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd offer to help. After dinner, I gathered the courage to ask, "Have you saved anything for college?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My dad looked at me like I'd asked the dumbest question in the world. "For you," he said, raising an eyebrow. "No, all our savings are for Ethan." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What do you mean? You haven't saved anything for me at all." My mom chimed in, her tone matter-of-fact. "Ethan's going to need help in the future. He's the youngest, and with his health history, we have to make sure he's taken care of. You're older, you'll figure it out." I stared at them, trying to process what they were saying. They didn't just prioritize Ethan emotionally. They had financially written me off as well. I felt like I was suffocating, sitting there at that table while they dismissed my future as if it didn't matter. My dad must have noticed my reaction because he added, "We can help you apply for a student loan if you need one, but you'll have to pay it off yourself once you start working." That was it. That was all they were willing to offer. I managed to nod and mumble a thank you, but inside I was seething. They had spent my entire life prioritizing Ethan, and now they were doing the same with his future. It was like I didn't exist. A few weeks later, my grandparents sat me down at the kitchen table. I could tell they had something serious to talk about, but I had no idea what it was. My grandma took my hand and said, "We've been thinking about your college plans, and we want you to know you don't have to worry about the money." I blinked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" My grandpa smiled, his eyes warm. "We set up a trust fund for you years ago. We didn't want to tell you until you were older, but it's enough to cover most of your college expenses." For a moment I couldn't speak. Tears filled my eyes as the weight of their words sank in. They had planned for my future when my own parents hadn't. They had seen my potential, believed in me, and taken steps to make sure I had every opportunity to succeed. "You did that for me?" I finally managed to say. "Of course we did." my grandma said, squeezing my hand. You deserve it. When my parents found out about the trust fund, they were furious. Not because they cared about my future, but because they thought it was unfair to Ethan. My mom called my grandparents, demanding to know why they hadn't set up a fund for him as well. He doesn't need one, my grandpa said firmly. You've spent his entire life prioritizing him. This is for her. My parents didn't take that well. They accused my grandparents of playing favorites and insisted that they were being unfair by giving me money while Ethan got nothing. My grandparents stood their ground, explaining that they had made this decision because they had watched me be overlooked for years. They weren't playing favorites, they were trying to level the playing field. But my parents didn't see it that way. They even tried to guilt me into sharing the trust fund with Ethan. You should think about your brother's future, my mom said. He'll need help when it's time for him to go to college. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had done nothing to support me, and now they wanted me to give up the one thing that was finally going to help me succeed? It's not my responsibility to pay for Ethan's college, I told them firmly. This isn't even my money, it's from Grandma and Grandpa. If you want him to have a fund, you should have planned for it. They didn't like that answer, but for once I didn't care. I was done letting them make me feel guilty for simply existing. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was a symbol of the love and support my grandparents had given me, and I wasn't about to let my parents take that away. With the trust fund in place, I was able to go to college without the crushing burden of debt hanging over me. It was the first time in my life I felt like I could breathe, like I had a real chance at building a future for myself. My parents' absence in my life became even more pronounced during those years. They didn't call to check in, didn't ask about my classes, and didn't visit. The only people who stayed by my side were my grandparents, who sent care packages and called regularly to make sure I was doing okay. By the time I graduated, I knew one thing for sure. I owed everything to my grandparents. Without them, I wouldn't have made it. By the time I graduated from college, I had learned to live with the absence of my parents' involvement in my life. I had stopped hoping for their approval or recognition a long time ago, but some small part of me still carried the wish buried deep that maybe things could change. Maybe now that I had accomplished something big, something undeniably worth celebrating, they'd finally notice me. Graduation day was bittersweet. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. I had worked hard, excelled academically, and landed a degree in a field I was passionate about, all without any help from my parents. My grandparents, of course, were there beaming with pride. My grandma cried when my name was called, and my grandpa, who had passed away by then, was there in spirit. I had done it for them as much as for myself, but my parents weren't there. I hadn't even bothered to invite them. Why would I? They hadn't cared about any of my achievements up to this point, so why would they care now? Still, as I looked out into the crowd of proud families cheering for their graduates, I felt a pang of longing. It wasn't just the absence of my parents. It was the absence of the family dynamic I had always dreamed of having. A few weeks after graduation, I landed my first real job. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it paid well, and it felt like the start of a new chapter in my life. For the first time, I was financially independent and no longer tied to anyone's expectations but my own. The first paycheck I received felt like gold in my hands, not because of the money itself but because it represented freedom. That's when the idea hit me. Maybe I could use this milestone to try and reconnect with my parents. For years I had been holding on to anger, resentment, and disappointment, but deep down, I still wanted to believe they could change. Maybe now that I was an adult with a steady job, we could have a relationship built on mutual respect. Maybe they'd finally see me for who I was. A capable, accomplished person who just wanted their love. I decided to plan a surprise for them. I wanted to celebrate not just my success but the idea of rebuilding our bond. I booked a reservation at an upscale restaurant, the kind of place my parents would appreciate, and planned to tell them during dinner about a special gift I had prepared. Cruise tickets for the three of us. I thought it would be the perfect way to spend quality time together, away from distractions, and maybe heal some of the wounds from the past. As for Ethan, I decided I'd buy him a thoughtful gift later so he wouldn't feel left out, but this dinner, and the cruise, was just for my parents and me. When I called to invite them to dinner, they seemed genuinely excited. "We'll be there," my mom said, her voice full of enthusiasm. "It'll be nice to catch up." For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. The evening of the dinner, I arrived at the restaurant early. I had reserved a nice table near the window and ordered a bottle of wine for the three of us to share. I wanted everything to be perfect. I sat there, rehearsing in my head how I'd tell them about the cruise tickets, imagining their surprised and happy reactions. I thought maybe this could be the moment we started fresh. But as the minutes ticked by, they didn't show up. First, I thought maybe they were stuck in traffic. I kept glancing at the door, expecting to see them walk in any second. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Then 45. The server came by a few times, politely asking if I was ready to order, and I kept stalling, feeling more embarrassed with every visit. Other diners were starting to notice that I was sitting alone, and the humiliation of it all was sinking in. I called my parents several times, but they didn't pick up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my dad answered. "Oh, we're running a little late," he said casually, as if it were no big deal. "We had to stop at the store to pick up something for Ethan." I froze. "What?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yeah, we found this great birthday gift for him, but your mom forgot her card at home, so we had to go back and get it," he said, as if I should have known this was more important than the dinner. "We'll be there soon. Just hang tight." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had spent the entire evening shopping for Ethan's birthday gift, something they could have done any other day, and had completely forgotten about me. I tried to keep my composure, but the anger and hurt bubbling inside me were impossible to ignore. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. "I've been sitting here for almost an hour." "Don't be dramatic," my dad replied, his tone dismissive. "We're on our way now." I hung up without saying another word. Sitting there at that empty table, I realized how foolish I'd been. I had spent weeks planning this dinner, hoping it would be the start of something better, and they couldn't even be bothered to show up on time. Once again, Ethan was their priority, and I was an afterthought. I flagged down the server, paid for my meal, and left. On the drive home, my phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and messages from my parents, but I ignored them. I didn't want to hear their excuses or their half-hearted apologies. By the time I got home, I had several voicemails from my mom, all of them accusing me of being rude for leaving before they arrived. One message in particular stuck out. "You always overreact," she said. "We were only a little late. Ethan's gift was important. We couldn't just leave it behind. If you can't understand that, maybe you're the one with the problem." I stared at my phone, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Even now, after everything, they were doubling down on their neglect and blaming me for being upset. They hadn't changed. They were never going to change. That night I made a decision. I was done. Done chasing their approval. Done trying to fix a relationship they clearly didn't care about. Done pretending that their behavior was something I just had to accept. I blocked their numbers and deleted their voicemails. I didn't even bother to explain myself. What was the point? They had made it clear where I stood in their lives, and I wasn't going to waste any more time or energy on them. The cruise tickets I had purchased were non-refundable, and for a brief moment I considered throwing them away. But then I thought of my grandma, my rock, my constant source of love and support. She deserved a break just as much as I did. So instead of canceling the trip, I invited her and my best friend to join me. The three of us spent a week cruising along the coast, soaking up the sun and making memories I'll cherish forever. For the first time in years I felt free. Free from their expectations, their neglect, and their constant prioritization of Ethan. I wasn't their invisible child anymore. I was my own person, surrounded by people who truly cared about me. The decision to cut ties with my parents wasn't something I made lightly. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment reaction to their behavior at the dinner. It was the culmination of years, decades really, of being treated like an afterthought. That night at the restaurant was simply the final push, the moment when I realized I was done giving them chances. They had shown me over and over who they were and how little I mattered to them. It was time for me to accept it and move on. Blocking their numbers was the first step. I felt a strange mix of emotions when I did it: relief, guilt, and a lingering sadness that things had come to this. But more than anything, I felt free. For so long, I had carried the weight of their neglect, constantly bending over backward to earn their love and attention. Letting go of that burden felt like taking a deep breath after holding it in for years. My brother Ethan was quick to get involved after he found out what had happened. A few days after I blocked my parents, he called me from his own number. At first I considered ignoring him too, but part of me was curious about what he had to say. Maybe he wanted to understand my side of things. Maybe he wanted to acknowledge the hurt I had carried all these years. I should have known better. When I answered the phone, his tone was accusatory from the start. "Mom and Dad told me what happened," he said. "You really just left them sitting there at the restaurant? Do you know how disappointed they are in you?" I couldn't believe it. Here I was finally standing up for myself, and Ethan of all people was trying to guilt me for it. "Ethan," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could, "they didn't show up. I sat there alone for almost an hour while they were out shopping for your birthday gift. And they didn't even apologize. What was I supposed to do? Sit there all night waiting for them to remember I exist?" "It wasn't a big deal," he shot back. "You're always so dramatic about stuff like this. They were just running late." "They weren't running late," I snapped. "They didn't care. That's the difference, Ethan. They've never cared. And you, of all people, should know that." There was a long pause on his end before he finally said, "They care about you. You just don't see it because you're too focused on yourself." I laughed bitterly. "Right. They care so much that they forgot my birthday more than once. They care so much that they've never been to a single school event in my entire life. They care so much that they couldn't even show up for one dinner I planned to celebrate my accomplishments." "Sure, Ethan. That sounds like love." He tried to argue, but I cut him off. "You don't get it because you've never had to fight for their attention. You've always been their favorite. And that's fine. I'm not blaming you for that. But don't stand there and tell me I'm the problem when I've spent my whole life being ignored by them." Ethan stayed silent for a moment before finally saying, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You should come to my birthday party and apologize to them. Fix things." "I'm not apologizing for finally standing up for myself," I said firmly. "And I'm not coming to your party. This isn't about you, Ethan. This is between me and them." He didn't take it well. He accused me of being selfish, of overreacting, of punishing our parents for things that weren't even their fault. But I didn't let his words get to me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had the upper hand. I wasn't going to let him or anyone else convince me that I was wrong for choosing myself. Over the next few weeks, the messages from my parents continued, but I ignored every single one. My dad left a voicemail claiming they wanted to talk things through and move past this, but I wasn't interested. Their version of moving past things usually involved sweeping everything under the rug and pretending nothing had happened. I wasn't going to fall for that again. What hurt the most were the messages my mom sent me on Facebook. She didn't apologize or acknowledge the pain they had caused me. Instead, she doubled down. She called me childish for blocking them and accused me of being ungrateful for all the things they'd done for me over the years. "We sacrificed so much for you and Ethan," she wrote in one message. "The least you could do is be more understanding." It was laughable. Sacrifice for me? What sacrifices had they made for me? They hadn't saved a dime for my education. They hadn't spent any time supporting my dreams or celebrating my successes. Every decision they'd made, every sacrifice they'd claimed, had been for Ethan, and I wasn't going to let them rewrite history to make themselves look like the victims. After the cruise with my grandma and best friend, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The trip was exactly what I needed. A chance to escape, to recharge, and to remind myself that I was surrounded by people who truly loved me. My grandma, in particular, was thrilled to be included. She hadn't been on a vacation in years, and seeing her laugh and relax made my heart swell. When I posted a few pictures from the trip on Facebook, I forgot to block my parents from seeing them. Big mistake. Within hours, my dad had sent me a series of angry messages, accusing me of being selfish for taking my grandma on the trip instead of inviting them. "How could you leave us out like that?" he wrote. "You've been punishing us ever since that dinner. Grow up and stop acting like a spoiled brat." His audacity stunned me. I had spent my entire life bending over backward to earn their love, and now that I was finally prioritizing myself, they had the nerve to call me selfish? For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel hurt by their words. I felt angry. How dare they try to guilt me for choosing the people who had actually been there for me? I blocked them on Facebook after that, and it felt like closing the final chapter of a very painful book. I was done. Truly completely done. No more messages, no more voicemails, no more attempts at reconciliation. I had given them every chance in the world, and they had squandered all of them. In the months that followed, my life became infinitely more peaceful. Without the constant emotional weight of my parents' neglect and favoritism, I was able to focus on myself. I poured my energy into my career, my friendships, and my relationship with my grandma. She and I grew closer than ever, and I made a promise to myself that I would spend as much time with her as I could. She had been my rock through everything, and I wanted her to know just how much she meant to me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly living for myself, not for the approval of people who had never cared enough to give it. It's been months since I cut ties with my parents, and for the first time in my life I feel free. Free from the constant longing for approval, the endless comparisons to Ethan, and the pain of being ignored. Cutting them off wasn't easy. It's never easy to walk away from people you're supposed to call family, but it was necessary. And as hard as it was, I don't regret it. In their absence, I've learned to build a life filled with people who actually care about me. My grandma remains my rock, and I've made her a permanent part of my plans for the future. We've gone on more trips together, and I cherish every moment I spend with her. My best friend has also been a huge support, reminding me that family isn't always about blood. It's about love, trust, and mutual respect. As for Ethan and my parents, I've let go of the anger. Holding on to it only kept me tied to them emotionally, and I don't want them to have that kind of power over me anymore. I don't need their validation. I don't need their love. I've learned to give those things to myself instead. Cutting ties has taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. Sometimes, the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to keep. And that's okay. Surrounding yourself with people who uplift you, who see you, and who truly care, that's what matters most. Looking back, I feel proud of the person I've become despite everything. I've worked hard, built a life I'm proud of, and found peace in ways I never thought possible. My parents may never change, and Ethan may never understand my side of the story, but that's no longer my burden to bear. I'm finally free to live my life on my terms, surrounded by people who love me for who I am. Family isn't always what you're born into. It's what you choose. And I've chosen mine.